Call it luck, call it privilege, call it blindness. I had traveled across Europe before I'd seen much of the Midwest. I was studying Chinese before I could interpret one of those really thick southern drawls. I knew more about current events in the Middle East than I knew about what was going on in California, Oregon, Washington, let alone Alaska. I had donated to a charity working in Africa before I'd done much of anything in my own community. The future was global, I kept hearing, and we'd all have to be global citizens. Any problems we had here in America were either too minor or of too long standing for us to make much of a dent in. So perhaps it's not surprising that I was overseas when it happened, but 6 months after Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the Gulf Coast, I went to New Orleans, where I saw this slide. You can take it as a bit of gallows humor from a battered but resilient place. It reads, Louisiana, third world, and proud of it. But it bears remembering, although it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, that whole towns had been wiped off the map. With a quarter of the city's population living beneath the poverty line, many had been unable or were unwilling to flee, given the prospect of extended unemployed exile, lacking cars, lacking cash. Across the region, 15 million people were affected. Over 1,800 people lost their lives. 400,000 jobs disappeared. 275,000 homes were destroyed. And compounding the apparently natural disaster was a man-made disaster of government corruption, underinvestment, incompetence. It extended to ordinary people as well. Over 13,000 instances of fraud resulted in $1 billion in aid money stolen. But this bumper sticker, and bumper stickers, I think, are a uniquely American form of expression, one of our great cultural iconic forms. This particular bumper sticker just began to express, despite being tongue-in-cheek, some of the rage and shame that I felt and that many of us felt in the weeks and months after Hurricane Katrina. But I had to admit that it also testified to a more enduring state of affairs. Louisiana is a state rich in natural resources and yet remains the poorest in the nation, laboring under the kind of resource curse that we usually attribute to third world nations. In some counties of Louisiana, 50% of the population under the age of 18 lives in poverty. The incarceration rate in the state is rivaled only by that in the Gulag Archipelago at its height, Soviet Union in the 1930s. A few hundred miles to the north up the Mississippi River, we're in Memphis, Tennessee. These are two stainless steel numbered discs marking the graves of infants in Shelby County Cemetery, known locally as Babyland, where 17,000 newborns who died in their first days or stillborn infants are buried. The infant mortality rate in Memphis is 3 times the national rate, comparable to Libya, Oman, Sri Lanka. It's connected to low birth weight, inadequate prenatal care, high rates of prematurity, but more broadly also to poverty and education. The Mississippi Delta is home to many of the 1.5 million American households that live on $2 a day or less. That's a metric we developed in the United Nations to look at the world's most desperate corners, but that we now have to use here at home. And then there's the mysterious role of race. African Americans of all classes are disproportionately affected in Memphis by this issue. We're the foreign country in your backyard, so says Teresa Two Bulls, former president of the Oglala Sioux tribe. We're in the Badlands of South Dakota, Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which has the lowest life expectancy of any place in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti, 48 years for men, 52 years for women. This is on par with sub-Saharan Africa. There's no easy explanation, there's no pat solution, but this is clearly part of a welter of issues, including isolation, alcoholism, diabetes, shocking rates of poverty and unemployment on the res. The larger background is a criminal history of land theft, broken treaties, cultural destruction, and chronic neglect. Another mountain disappears in central Appalachia, mountaintop removal to get at the coal. Economic desperation in the region means that everything is now up for sale. We're on the border between southeast Kentucky and West Virginia, the whitest part of the country. 98% of the population in some counties is white, but also the part of the country with the lowest literacy rates among native English speakers, with the least formal education. In some counties, only 6 or 7% of the population has gone to college, on par with Iraq and Gabon, and close to half the population doesn't have a high school degree. We're in Duraville, Southern California, home to 4,000 people until recently, a trailer park shantytown off the grid. This stands in for the thousands of colonias, as they're called, that stretch along the U.S. border with Mexico for over 1,000 miles. In the 1950s, unscrupulous developers began dividing up land which had little or no agricultural value into tiny lots, selling it to people who were desperate to have any kind of home. there was little or no infrastructure attached to these lots. Water, sewage, you name it. In Texas alone, an estimated 400,000 people, overwhelmingly Chicano, but 2/3 of them born here in this country, live in over 2,000 colonias, often without paved roads, proper drainage, or public utility services. They represent, collectively, the largest single concentration of people in the U.S. living without basic sanitation, a situation unparalleled elsewhere in the developed world. If you take the colonias of Webb County, Texas, an estimated 45% of residents live without basic wastewater service or potable water. You literally can't drink the water. In the Americas, this compares only with Haiti. In Africa, with places like Uganda, Madagascar, Congo. Some progress has been made over the years, but it's been stymied by the remoteness of these communities, comparatively, the cost of connecting them to the grid, but more than that, the political powerlessness of those who live there. And meanwhile, we invest in a massive, useless wall along the border. We're on the other side of the country, the Rust Belt centered on the Great Lakes. This is the town of Gloversville, New York, where once upon a time 90% of the world's gloves were made. The man standing in the doorframe lives surrounded by abandoned glove factories, which he watches for squatters and drug addicts. He ekes out a living by fixing up junked vehicles. Towns like Gloversville, like parts of Detroit, Youngstown, Camden, and so many cities in the Rust Belt, are essentially failed cities in the same way that we talk about failed states in the Third World. Overwhelmed by bankruptcy, corruption, deep-seated unemployment, sustained human flight, these places have lost half of their population in the last several decades, a breakdown in the very fabric of social life. So these 5 regions just begin to introduce us to the Third World within our own borders. They're at demonstrably Third World levels of development across many indices, crucial indices: health, education, environment, infrastructure, housing, and so forth. The colonias of the U.S.-Mexico border, much of Indian country represented by Pine Ridge, the Mississippi Delta, Central Appalachia, the Rust Belt centered on the Great Lakes. Notice both the range of geographic locations involved, but also of racial and ethnic groups, the inclusion of inner cities, rural areas, small towns, and even some suburbs. No kind of community is immune. There are many other places we could discuss too, taking a deep dive of American regionalism. When I told people that I was trying to map some of the Third World within our own borders, I started hearing about places that were unfamiliar to me, that I'd never heard of before. The Boot Heel of Missouri, the Four Corners region, the Sandhills of Nebraska. I started hearing about the conditions of migrant farm workers in the Pacific Northwest, modern slavery in Florida, parts of the Central Valley of California, the North Carolina backcountry, forgotten mid-sized cities in the Midwest and the Northeast, indeed even parts of Alaska. So let's drill down deeper for a moment and look all the way down at the most granular level that we can. Census tracts are not always natural communities, but they are the units of American life that are best studied and best known at that scale. By looking at a census tract, you can get a sense of factors that are otherwise hidden when you're just at regional, state, or county levels. So this is my own neighborhood, Brooklyn, New York, Census Tract 39, although nobody really refers to themselves as being from Census Tract 39, even me, where the median household income is $53,000. If you walk less than 10 minutes north to a neighboring census tract, there's an impoverished set of public housing projects where the median household income is just over $9,000 a year, down 36% over the last decade, a figure that almost nobody can live off in this country, let alone in New York City, even with a social safety network. Just another 10-minute walk in the neighborhood, a census tract where households on average earn over $108,000, their earnings up over 37% in the past decade, both from wealthier people moving in and from some residents doing better. The contrast in daily life is as tremendous as you would imagine. Trendy cafes give way to a food desert. Safe streets give way to crime-ridden streets. The Gini coefficient is what statisticians use to measure income inequality. 0 represents total equality, 1 represents maximal inequality. Namibia, by this measure, is the world's most unequal country. Sweden, the world's most equal. The US falls somewhere in between. But if you look at places like New York City, and New York is far from alone, we're much more Namibia than we are Sweden. Our cities are much more Johannesburg and Bogota than they are Tokyo or Paris. Across America, towns and cities have their other side of the train tracks. There's a reason why that turn of phrase has come into our language. Places where inequality is literally etched into the landscape, where extreme wealth and extreme poverty live in secret, sinister symbiosis. Of course, there can be something positive about rich and poor living side by side, living in the same neighborhoods, but our brand of inequality, by and large,
is a kind of hyper-inequality, not leading to greater understanding, but to what the philosopher Michael Sandel calls skyboxification. We have more mistrust, less solidarity. We create our own private universes just 10 minutes walk away from each other. So we know America has problems, but why talk about the third world? Why talk about the third world specifically within our own borders? The term was coined in 1952 by Alfred Sauvy, a French demographer, anthropologist, and historian. He was referring to the Third Estate, that immense class of commoners who unleashed the French Revolution. He meant as first world countries, the US and its NATO allies, second world countries, the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies. Third world countries were by and large unaligned at the time. They were just breaking free of colonial rule. They were becoming gradually proxies and clients of both sides in the Cold War. And at first they seemed to stagnate. For several decades, the action was in Europe and in a reviving East Asia. These were the growing economies of the time. The US had competition, but it came mostly from its allies. Now, in the last 20 years, we've seen a reconfiguration of that. The former Second World is now in transition, or less developed. We have new language. We're trying on new terminologies. The Global South, developing countries, less developed countries, the bottom billion. These are the latest, more politically correct terms to describe a moving target. We talk about the Fourth World as well, the world of marginalized indigenous peoples, groups who are sovereign but without a nation state. We talk about failed states, the worst offenders, the newly industrialized countries, aka cheap labor for the taking, emerging markets, good for speculating in, the heavyweight BRIC countries, perhaps most promising and most threatening of all. But never mind all the rephrasing, never mind the terminology. Third world still remains the clearest, simplest, most honest way of putting it. Just as sometimes it's important to say poor instead of underprivileged, less privileged, disadvantaged, low income, to use a term that has some of the sting of honesty and of the lived experience of those who are going through it. So on this map, the areas in red still represent areas, zones of emergency. But the areas in orange by far make up the bulk of what has traditionally been termed the third world. In these places, it's less about imminent starvation and collapse than it is about deep inequality, about shanty towns abutting gated communities, elites amassing vast fortunes while commoners get the crumbs. So it's better than it was. After several decades of growth, democracy, industrialization, transparency, rule of law, coming to some of these places, high commodity prices, outmigration, remittances, flattening population growth. But meanwhile, here at home, we've seen stagnation and decay. But the map we need is about more than just color-coding countries. We need a map more like this one from the Atlas of Poverty Project, which happens to be focused on infant mortality, but begins to show how the first world is becoming speckled with third worldness, not only here in the US, but increasingly elsewhere as well. You can see it just in faint orange, which is circled in red. It also shows the increasing first worldness of traditionally third world places, whether it's the east coast of China, parts of southern India, much of western Turkey, the Persian Gulf, certain cash crop regions, many cities, and so on. This, in some sense, begins to get at the real meaning, spatially, of what globalization driven by free trade is bringing about, of growing global elite cohesion, of the dissolving of borders, again, at least for elites. We're moving towards a patchwork world where there's no neat division of first world, second world, third world, but instead we're seeing archipelagos of misery growing up anywhere, indeed, next door. I've focused on facts, on data, on a general new framework for understanding some American problems and their place in the world. This idea, this burgeoning meme of a third world within our own borders is now filtering even into the political conversation. We see Romney and Obama talking about third world education, third world infrastructure in their election rhetoric. But what we need to do is seize the opportunity to make a serious conversation out of this, to actually draw lessons out of this way of seeing things. In some areas, we have to recognize the problems are emergent, parts of the Rust Belt and now the Sun Belt, some of the colonias, indeed now inner ring suburbs. In other areas like the Mississippi Delta, the problems are deep-rooted, going back far into American history. The way we lifted ourselves out of the Depression and the declaration of the war on poverty prove that we can undertake serious national undertakings, initiatives that move the dial. Just to give one example, many of the problems I've been discussing today adversely and overwhelmingly impact young people, teens, young families, single mothers, because those previous efforts did so much to lift many senior citizens out of poverty and changed the demographic nature of many of these issues. So it's time for a renewal of that spirit of the 30s and 60s. Time to go deep into the American landscape, as granular as the census tract when we need to, but also focusing on broader regions, broader patterns. So I've come back from living in the third world beyond our borders, determined not to see the imposition of a third world here on our own soil. Can we really be global citizens in an age of such emergency at home? That has become the standing challenge to what was the unquestioning internationalism of my generation, which is what I started with. We need to consider the possibility of what we might call social Superfund sites, places that have the kind of dedicated, high-level focus that we've traditionally brought to areas of environmental disaster. We need to consider and hold up to scrutiny the concept of American exceptionalism, an ideology which has blinded us to many of our own deficiencies and made us unable to learn from other systems, other examples, whether it's the education system in Finland or the way healthcare is delivered in France or public housing provision in Singapore. We need to consider the possibilities of third world, developing world style aid for ourselves, that which we've been promoting and funding and deploying outside our borders, whether it might have some use here at home. And finally, we need to approach all of this with a new humility, understanding that it can happen here, and it is happening here. Thank you.